Hi, I'm DJ Schleen. I'm here with Alanna Brown from Puppet. And Alanna, nice to see you. Nice to meet you actually on camera.
Hi, DJ. It's so nice to be here. Nice to meet you.
Well, I'm really excited to be talking to you today. The State of DevOps report from Puppet just came out, and I had a chance to read it a few weeks ago. Still digging through it. There's a lot of information in there, but I wanted to get in touch with you and just talk to you a bit about some of the new elements in there, especially security. And I'm a big security aficionado, I guess you could say. And I wanted to ask some questions about that. But before I get into the security aspects, tell me how the State of DevOps report started.
Well, I started the State of DevOps report back in 2012. Actually, really, the seed of the idea happened in 2011 when I first started at Puppet. And I really wanted to do a big research project and start to understand the space because I was pretty new to it. And I kind of like data. And so I wanted to do a research project. And DevOps at that time was still fairly nascent, I would say. Most people were pretty cynical about it and really thought it was a buzzword, a marketing buzzword that would just die in another year. But here we are today, and we are still talking about DevOps, and I think that's so fascinating. And so when I first started, the timing just happened to work out really well because I knew that Gene Kim, who is local to Portland, was working on the Phoenix project at the time, and he was about to publish it. So I reached out to him and I was like, hey, Gene, would you be interested in collaborating on this new State of DevOps research that I want to do? And he was like, yeah, sure, that sounds awesome. I actually have a background in IT research. Yeah, and then he brought in Jez Humble, because they were good friends. And Jez Humble, if you're not familiar with him, wrote the book on continuous delivery. And we started our collaboration then, and it was really fun. We worked together for a number of years before they started Dora. We covered a lot of ground. We looked into IT performance. We kind of defined that. We looked at the different outcomes we were seeing from a DevOps initiative, looked into various leadership styles, culture, burnout. So we covered a lot of ground in those couple of years that we worked together. And we have been continuing the State of DevOps report ever since. Last year, we partnered with Splunk, and Andy Mann was a co-author. He's fantastic. And this year we worked with Splunk and Circle CI as well. So we've got Mike Stonke, who was a co-author both last year and this year, who is the VP of Engineering for Circle CI.
That's awesome. Working with Jez and Gene must have been pretty incredible, especially back in the early days of the report. And you guys started this like only a few years after the term DevOps started becoming mainstream, right?
Yeah.
So you said you had a little bit of resistance from is this just a marketing term? I've seen people call it DevOps teams and DevOps, engineers, and for me, it's like it's like this Zen type of thing. It's not really a role you play, right? It's a practice. What are your thoughts on that from what you've seen?
Yeah, absolutely. Like there was a ton of resistance from the beginning to label anything DevOps. And even internally, there was a ton of cynicism. It was like, well, we've been doing this all along, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Putting a new label on it, or like the term DevOps engineer for a while, that was kind of a hot button topic. Like, can you really be a DevOps engineer? Is there such a thing as a DevOps product, right? And I think fundamentally, it doesn't really matter what the label is, because as long as the label kind of brings awareness to some of the issues that teams face as they're trying to deliver software at a much faster pace with, a bunch of different challenges in their way, like as long as it brings awareness to that and it helps people, that's really all that matters to me. I don't care if it's called DevOps or DevSecOps or something else entirely. I do know from working with the DevOps community and with thousands of customers all around the world that this is a super impactful thing, a super impactful movement, and it's really helping reshape how we think about how we deliver software and how we work together to do that.
So in the report, you start getting into more security this year, and it's something that I was really excited about and what really caught my eye. In the term DevSecOps comes into play and all this kind of thing. You know, when you talk about the terminology, do you think DevSecOps is more of a siloization of DevOps, like just two different teams now in people's eyes?
I don't see it as two separate things, really. Like, I think if you are doing DevOps well, then you are probably doing security pretty well. And if you're doing security well, you're probably doing DevOps pretty well. I think, again, they're just labels, and whatever you or your organization deems as important is really all that matters. And so, yeah, we did focus on security this year, and I'll give you some background information about that. So last year in 2018, we actually did something kind of remarkable where, for a long time we had been hearing all of these DevOps stories, and there were some patterns that started to emerge from them about how people adopted and scaled their DevOps practices. So we really wanted to dig into that and see if those patterns held true at kind of an aggregate broad level. And so, we put together a survey and we found that there is an evolutionary model to DevOps. And there are 5 stages in that model, starting with like a normalization and standardization period, a period where you're starting to really expand DevOps practices across multiple teams. And then in the later stages of that DevOps evolution, what we start to see is that security becomes really, really important. So in stage 4, we start to see that security policy configurations are automated. And then in stage 5, we see that the security teams are working early on to help define the technology and the design and delivery phases. And so we thought that was really interesting. It was something that we really wanted to hone in on. So that's why we ended up with security this year.
Yeah, it's great. What's the most surprising thing that you've seen from a security perspective since the report came into fruition back in, I think it was 2012, right, with the first report?
Yeah, well,
going up.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot of improvements in how ops and dev teams work. And I think for a lot of organizations, and I've gone and talked to many organizations, and I know that for most of them, one of the most challenging aspects of DevOps is actually bringing their security teams on board and integrating those security practices into the software delivery lifecycle. And I think a lot of organizations think of security as a necessary evil. And I really feel like it doesn't have to be that way. And if you look at this year's research, it shows us that actually integrating security early and often actually delivers real results, but the path to get there isn't straightforward. And so one of the most surprising things for me is seeing, like, really viscerally how messy it gets in the middle stages of DevOps evolution with regards to security.
And that's one of the things that I liked about the report, and I sort of queried it and was questioning it, which you said DevOps or or adding security to DevOps is messy or can be messy. Can you explain that a bit? That's like, is it a cultural mess? Is it a transformational mess? Tool set mess?
It's all of the above. And I think when you go to DevOps conferences, what you typically hear are the success stories, and it feels like it's just this linear upwards to the right, movement where they've just like been successful the whole way. But that's not how it really works. The reality is that DevOps is messy. Integrating security is messy, and especially in those middle stages. What's happening there is you kind of start out and you don't know what you don't know, right? So as you start to dig a little bit deeper, you're really opening up Pandora's box, and like all the duct tape and the glue that's held everything together is suddenly just like out exposed in front of you, and you start to hit these really big problems and that were masked, before, and then you start to reach this level of complexity that you were trying to cover up in the first place. So we've seen this happen in previous reports too from the data, and it's called the J curve, which means things are starting out really well. You're kind of getting the low-hanging fruit, you're pretty successful, you have a few quick wins under your belt, but then they actually get worse before they get better again. And so some of the ways that this showed up in the data is that we asked security teams if they encounter friction with delivery teams when they're collaborating together. And the friction is the highest in the middle stages, and it never goes away, really, even when those teams are fully integrated. Yeah. And when we looked at the security roles and compared them to the non-security roles, we actually found that the friction was even higher for security teams in the middle stages. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that DevOps is fundamentally about cultural change, right? And different teams, depending on where they are in that evolution, are going to experience that change differently. And it's really important for leaders to remember that.
And do you see that change being different between small startups versus larger enterprise, or as people start scaling out their programs?
Well, small startups have a lot of different problems that they have to deal with and fewer barriers because the teams are smaller. So oftentimes it is the IT ops team, for example, that is handling all the security stuff. So there isn't that same siloed approach to how delivery is done within the organization. So they have different problems, I think. And I'm sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Oh my God. I have an attention span of an eagle, I think. I'm not really sure. We can go on to one final question, though. I've taken a lot of your time up. And you've been very insightful about how security is that, that friction element to an extent. Again, you got it right on the head of the nail. Culture is that important thing. But, it's the end of a decade right now. And we're starting off a new decade. Where do you see DevOps going in the next 1 to 5 years? Where do you see the report taking us based on the trends?
Well, I love, so our CTO, Deepak, he's like, I don't really like to predict things because I don't like really being wrong. So I kind of feel the same way. But I think, there are still a lot of organizations out there, and we work with plenty of them, that are stuck in the middle stages. Like they've started and now they're stuck and they don't really know how to get out of those middle stages to reach like the DevOps nirvana, right? I believe that this is like not a one and done thing, by the way. Like this will, it's going to change over time what it means to be successful with DevOps. But I think what I'm seeing today as a trend is really a focus on security and starting to expand DevOps beyond just the 1 or 2 teams that have been successful with it, across more teams and across the business, to make that sort of the de facto way that everyone works together. And security is a big part of that equation. It is so important to bring security teams into the fold. I've been talking to a lot of organizations recently where they started out with security. That's who they went to first because security is a high priority in their organization. And so it's been really interesting to see how how that is changing as well, and people are putting security first. So I think that will be a bigger trend going forward.
And one actually more final thing. Any advice for the people who are at the bottom of that J curve, how they can get out of that that sort of rut?
Yeah, I would say first, keep automating. Like just keep automating what you can and going after the low-hanging fruit and looking for the things that are really painful, identifying them and prioritizing them to fix. And the other thing is like collaboration and sharing are so key to DevOps. In our last report, we found that really the practices that promote sharing are the ones that really, really propel you across, across those middle stages. So work on sharing what you have learned with other teams and making that work visible so you can also share it at different levels of the organization. So if you're a leader, a manager, a director, you should be sharing that success upwards and downwards, right? And if you're at that practitioner level, you should be sharing that success upwards. So just letting people know what you're working on and what you're doing and what impact it's really had on the business is important. And then finally, I'll say learn how to speak other people's language. Like we get so caught up in understanding what's important to us, but when we try to translate that across the business or we try to go and talk to security teams, like their concerns are really different. And so we need to understand how to speak their language. And that's part of getting buy-in to move forward with your DevOps initiative.
Well, that's great. Alanna, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a great conversation. I could probably talk to you for hours and hours on end about the philosophy of DevOps and where the industry is going and all the cultural elements that help make organizations successful. So again, thank you for joining me today, and I really appreciate it. Look forward to seeing you in Portland.
Thank you so much. Come visit me in Portland. Our puppet office is waiting for you.